Hello, hi everybody. Welcome back to our series on the US elections. Today we have the pleasure to have with us another friend and colleague, Mike Schmidli, who teaches US history and politics at the University of Leiden. Mike is also a colleague who sits in the board of the National Association of American Studies here in the Netherlands. Mike, it's a real pleasure to have you here today with us. And as usual now in our chats, I will let my colleague Adrias here to start off this conversation with you.
Thanks, Dario, and welcome to our vodcast, Mike. I was previously discussing this with Dario. We started this initiative as a way to in a sense, get an overview of all the expertise that we have here in the Netherlands, of people who teach America, interpret America for a Dutch audience. So far, by sheer coincidence, we've seemed to have exclusively interviewed Americans for it. And you yourself are from the United States, from the state of Oregon. So I suppose, as with George and Marke, the question then arises, how do you as an American in the Netherlands, but who interprets the United States for your Dutch students, how do you watch all the events that are, currently unfolding even within your home state?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, guys, and it's fun to talk. I think in terms of my students, I keep just pushing this idea that this is really unprecedented. The array of challenges that the United States is facing, the kind of multiple crises that it seems like things were at a point that couldn't really get any worse, and then huge wildfires took off in the Pacific Northwest, and it's sort of like, what's going to happen next, right? With the election looming, there's certainly weird stuff that's going to happen, and watching it from here and trying to make sense of it. That at one level, I'm really happy to be here because I'm seeing the evacuations in Oregon and the lockdown and just all of this really, serious hardship that's unfolding. There was an image that I saw the other day of 10,000 cars lined up at a food bank in San Antonio. And, it's just kind of hard to imagine 10,000 cars lined up for food, and the number of people that are just really, really suffering is it's without precedent in my lifetime, for sure. But at the same time, seeing it from here and just basically living through these screens, everything we do now is mediated by the working from home and talking to family through screens and all this kind of thing. My family in Oregon, trying to stay in touch with them, but never actually being able to visit them. It's just a little bit like I'm living on the moon. There are times where I feel really strange, and then you add into that this sense that for the first time, having a U.S. passport doesn't actually mean that much because we can't travel like we could in any other time in my life. It's a really unique feeling of just being sort of dislocated, just that this is not how it's always been or should be. And I think a lot of people really feel like that.
I already have a couple of questions, but I want first to ask Casey if he has any.
Well, Mike, you've published on you're a historian of U.S. foreign relations. You've published on Reagan and Latin America, on the United States and the human rights movement, on democracy promotion, which kind of brings us to the discussion of where foreign policy is within this election. If we sort of think back to that moment leading up to the 2016 election, I do recall that the potential implications of Donald Trump's election on the US's position in the world was maybe not the major theme of the election, but it was a significant presence, a significant source of commentary. And I don't know if either of you sort of remember this kind of never Trump moment, but these kind of figures within the Republican Party who stood up and said they were not themselves going to vote for Donald Trump and would in some cases prefer Hillary Clinton. A lot of those sort of came from the sort of hawkish, foreign policy, national security oriented wing of the Republican Party, figures like David Frum, George Bush's former speechwriter. And essentially the argument that these people were pushing forward was Donald Trump's election would be a disaster for the United States' position in the world, with its for its alliances, its prestige as a superpower. 4 years later, do you think those predictions have come true?
Yeah, I think, at a certain level, it's not as bad as a lot of people, predicted, or worst case scenario. I mean, NATO is still around, and the United States is still, it hasn't lost its global standing to such an extent that we can just sort of relegate it to, the dustbin of history or something, right? But I think at the same time, there has been a serious decline in terms of American prestige and in terms of the kind of core relationships with NATO allies, and certainly on issues like human rights. Trump from the very beginning, put out these ideas like torture works, and just to say that, even if it didn't turn into actual, policy like action, like it still just is very significant in terms of American ideals and American values being broadcast around the world. This sort of thing, it does matter because the United States is so influential in terms of the shaping how these kinds of norms develop and are maintained. So I think what you see is not so much that the U.S. has invaded Iran, or the kinds of these are the worst things that could happen. We'll get involved in yet another land war somewhere, this kind of thing. I mean, that stuff hasn't happened, but it's not clear to me whether that's just by luck or whether Trump actually brought to office a sort of an aversion for that sort of thing. I mean, I think what you see by many of these top Trump advisors who then leave and write the kind of tell-all narratives is that he's really unhinged, right? He has no experience. He has he's very attracted to power, right? So he's attracted to Putin. He's attracted to places like North Korea. He doesn't have any of the kind of moral underpinnings that even presidents that liberals love to criticize, like George W. Bush. I mean, now we're sort of like, oh man, wish we had Bush again, right? Because at least he wouldn't have, catered to Putin in the same way, right? To the same extent. I think.
Is that a view you agree with personally? Do you find yourself wishfully pining back to the days of W. Bush? It I think is a sad thing that with you have this kind of pattern where you're always thinking this has got to be the worst, and then another one comes along and you're like, oh man, I wish we could get back to when Bush was president, it was like, oh, remember Reagan, he was so great, and now we're like, oh, remember how great Bush was.
No, but what you were saying is something that puzzles me as a historian as well, because since at least Truman, if not before, we are used to associate doctrines to U.S. presidents when we analyze their own entanglements with the world. Truman's doctrine, Nixon's doctrine, Reagan's doctrines, to Obama's doctrines, whereas the lack of a doctrine, or if you want, the lack of a comprehensive strategic vision on how to deal with foreign policy and foreign affairs, is what has been characterizing Trump's presidency throughout this 4 years. And this, of course, has translated into sometimes an inconsistent, paradoxical, contradictory foreign policy, which has not, perhaps by luck, degenerated in any major accident. And yet leaves us, with a very uncomfortable position of not having those categories, those paradigms that we are used to have when we assess presidential foreign policies, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you see with Trump, it's so transactional, right? I mean, it's so focused on Trump's own sense of, is this beneficial to the U.S., but I mean, especially to him, right? I mean, and often just, I think, at a very basic level, he's still thinking in terms of things like, building Trump hotels and this kind of, excuse me, and trying to make sure that the Air Force is using his Trump hotels when they have soldiers that need to have a place to sleep in Scotland or someplace, right? This kind of thing. I feel like his view of the world is so limited, right? And his willingness to engage and read the briefing books and use the existing structure that it's not even on the level of when George W. Bush met with Putin and said, like, I looked into his eyes and I could see some, I mean, Trump is not even at that level. He's just sort of, yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, I agree. I completely agree with you, especially when you say that the United States is so influential that we can almost not even contemplate liberal world order without its role, being it hegemonic or not, but without the role of sometimes even over-imposing principles and norms. And I also agree with you when you say that Trump is just an egotistic, perhaps psychotic president who is only interested in advancing his own very personal agenda, which is not even a political agenda. And yet Trump's presidency has had some effects, some strategic effects in the definition of US foreign policy, the abandonment of NAFTA, a very realistic approach toward transatlantic or trans-Pacific relations. Now, do you think that these are characteristics of a Republican establishment, so they will be there, they will survive even without Trump, or it is, in a way, a consequence of Trump as a president?
Well, I think, I think what has happened is that, on those kinds of issues, Trump is really playing to his base, right? So the focus on the southern border, whether it's building the border wall or reworking the NAFTA agreement, I mean, this is the whole intermestic thing, right? Where domestic politics is influencing foreign policy, because I think what Trump is trying to do is convince Americans that the United States is under attack, whether it's terrorists or like this sort of jihadi kind of he's the sort of casting of all of Islam as a terrorist organization, right? Or that undocumented workers are coming over the U.S.-Mexico border, and it's a kind of a violence. They're either stealing jobs or they're raping innocent native-born Americans. This kind of thing, right? It's a classic kind of nativism that's fused with a war on terror mentality. And in the end, I mean, I feel like that what's driving this, the real goal is to so a sense of doubt and distrust and fear that will lead people to the conclusion that only by supporting Trump will they be safe, right? And that, I mean, that plays out on so many different issues where, he's trying to set the facts aside, right? He's trying to step aside from reality and play to this sort of, look, it isn't even about Republicans versus Democrats, because there's even a lot of Republicans who you shouldn't trust. It's about, me versus all the people who are trying to tear down this nation, right? And that's a kind of, in a way, it's a sort of a classic strongman type approach, but it plays out in this environment where, battles over issues like abortion and identity politics have, led to it. And I think, we often talk about political polarization, but what that implies is a kind of equal polarity where the two sides are both, out there spinning around, and in the middle is this center where nobody can actually get to. But in fact, it's the right wing that has gone way out there. And, the center and the liberals are being pulled into the orbit of the right. And so it's not exactly polarization, because this has been a kind of conservative game plan starting in the 70s and really intensifying in the 90s to create, obtain power and maintain power within this very specific political landscape. And I think Trump has just stepped it up and made it about his own worldview and personal political goals. And he's done so in a way that I think a lot of even people like Newt Gingrich didn't see that coming.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because a few days ago there was this analysis on the Wall Street Journal by Bobby Jindal, who basically said the same thing, that populism, if we want to use perhaps in the wrong way a term to summarize this phenomenon, is here to stay. It's not just about Trump, but it's about the nation that kind of replicates it and puts it in a position to hold the power. You're right. Can I ask you another question, which is related to what you were saying before, because that really triggered me. You say that these elections are kind of unprecedented, full of tension, of challenges, of if you want, destruction also, if you look at what's happening in the Pacific coast of the United States. And in a way, you're right, of course, because we are coming from now months of social turmoil, global pandemic, so that the pressure, the expectation of new presidents are very high. But if I put myself a little bit back in what I was and how I saw the elections in 2008, I think the feeling wasn't really that different. That there was America, or this entity for me as an international student who was engaged in very unjust wars all over the world, with a serious problem of legitimacy of international reputation. And then there was Katrina, a hurricane that brought about devastation in the south, devastation that overlapped, with social exclusion, economic inequality. So the things that perhaps my generation, now I can say, was looking for, was expecting from the next president was vision, a new idea of progress, of future, something that could really change the situation. Now, do you think this is the case today, that we want change, a new vision, or we just sort of looking for a return to normal? And that would be
maybe a different way to phrase it. What do you think Biden offers and has to offer?
They had an interview, I think it was on BBC, with this group of young Americans, and their slogan is something like, Biden is boring, but we should vote for him anyway. And you get a lot of that sort of thing, right? Like, I think that the expectations, have, it's very different, right? I mean, I remember watching Obama give his speech on the night that he won, and I just had this feeling of this is really momentous, right? This is like history in the making. And if Biden wins in November, I mean, I'm probably just going to go to bed, right? I don't even because there's just this sort of, he's an establishment guy. He believes in the diplomatic core, right? He believes in the infrastructure that underpins governance, this kind of thing. And at the same time, I mean, we can't lose sight of the fact that within this series of crises, opportunities have opened up that are really quite amazing. I mean, think about the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests that have happened. I mean, there is potential there to take those really legitimate concerns and turn them into real policy that will move the United States closer to equality than anything in the past few decades. I mean, Obama was really important, but in terms of when we look at that 8 years and say so what did he really do, for example, for African Americans? I mean, it's a limited. I mean, you can say, well, he's an African American who was president. That's quite a lot, right? Or you can look at things like judicial appointments. But nonetheless, I mean, it was not transformational necessarily. And I think that what you see, what we've seen in the last few months is this surge of energy that is combining with the Bernie Sanders focus on economic inequality, and there's this sense of this kind of seething under the veneer of a kind of, this is the prosperous United States where the stock market just keeps getting better. And I mean, I don't think there's anybody in America now that you could ask, what does economic inequality mean? And they would just be like, I don't know. I mean, I think everybody knows that there is a great divide between this tiny group that has huge wealth and everybody else. And if you ask people in America, what does Black Lives Matter stand for? They would give you a response. Everyone would. I mean, some would agree and some would disagree. But these are issues that are of signal importance, and that's why this election is so important. It's not just that Trump is polarizing, and his path so far has been very destructive in terms of the very pillars of American democracy. It's that within these crises, there's also a possibility for the real steps in dealing with these issues.
There are the conditions for a transformative presidency.
Yeah, and it may not be Biden, but it is, when you think about the United States over the next few decades, by 2045, the number of eligible white voters will be less than 50%. The nation is moving in a direction where either the Republican Party is going to change and reach out to a broader base than it's currently focusing on, or it's just going to get even better at disenfranchising people, right? I mean, it's going to kind of be one or the other. I mean, or it just disappears and something else comes out, right?
The way that we've been discussing it always invokes the memory of Lyndon Johnson for me. Like, very few people would have imagined sort of on the eve of Kennedy's assassination in '63 that a potential Johnson presidency would indeed be transformational on civil rights, right?
Having the same idea in mind.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that I mean, but at the same time, you think back on that moment, and I mean, the United States is so different than in 63, 64. Today, I think it's really hard to find the kind of the support that Johnson needed to get the Great Society off the drawing board and into legislation, and not just in terms of issues around race, but this broad array of issues. It's hard to imagine the Congress being able to get its act together enough to even do basic stuff, right? I mean, even just like, do we put the flag at half mast for a tragedy is like a big deal in this day and age. What do you need in order to have a transformational moment? I mean, there's going to have to be a big shift in the legislative branch. There's going to have to be some kind of clearing of the way, because the president can't do it alone. And remember that Obama was always really criticized for using executive orders instead of going through Congress. This is the problem: is the more stymied the Congress becomes, the more Americans look to the president to do everything. Every time there's a natural disaster, the president should be there. Every time that legislation doesn't get passed, it's the president's fault. And it's very easy to sort of pin problems on an individual that everybody knows, but there has to be some change that happens in Congress in order to facilitate meeting these challenges. Otherwise, it's just going to the partisan squabbling is just going to make. They've done these polls where they've asked Americans these sort of funny questions like who do you like better, polygamy or the Congress, or this sort of and they're like, well, I guess I'll go with polygamy. I mean, this kind of thing. That just underscores a sense that Americans have of the Congress being just broken. And yet, I mean, it's not that Americans have given up on the Congress. They want the Congress to work. And so there's this sort of weird disconnect between what Americans want the Congress to do and their fundamental belief in, the old cartoon, how a bill becomes a law and Mr. Smith goes to Washington, and the sense of, something's messed up right now, So, I think there's that kind of that area of reform, just cleaning up how Congress gets together and passes legislation is itself potentially transformational, right?
Yeah, well, of course, all they say, we shouldn't forget that Trump ran on a platform that was outspokenly, anti-politics in this sense, drain the swamp. All about going against what especially the legislative branch, not only the executive one, represents. But do you see this change as possible also in congressional politics?
I mean, it's hard. It's possible to imagine, but it's hard to imagine the Congress doing it to itself, right? It's like, when is Congress ever going to lower its own salary? I mean, never, right? They're not going to do that. And so, issues like lobbying and the amount of time that members of Congress spend raising money, these are real concerns and impediments to passing legislation. And then you get into just the injustice of the Senate giving states like Wyoming, 2 senators when there aren't hardly 500,000 people in Wyoming, right? I mean, this is the kind of it's a problem that then plays into the Electoral College and the more fundamental issues that So I read that there are different estimates, but so Biden wins by 2 or 3 million votes. His chances of actually taking the White House are like 1 in 10, right? Or if he wins by 5 million, maybe it's half and half. He wins by 8 million votes, he still might not get into the White House. This is really problematic, right?
And for those, I mean, this theme of gridlock in Congress has by now become kind of such an established part of how we sort of analyze and view American politics. Just to kind of remind us that it hasn't always been this way. I mean, you've written on Reagan. Reagan works for the majority of his presidency with at least a Democratic House of Representatives. So what is it that, I mean, is this gridlock, this polarization, to what extent do you see it as a kind of permanent fixture of our political predicament? Or do you see it a possibility for change there as well? I mean, as a historian, we can afford to take the long view. as concerns, I mean, in our case, concerned observers, in your case, as concerned citizens, we might wish for a shorter time horizon.
Yeah, I mean the problem is, at least, I'm not sure if it feels like we're running out of time, right? On a lot of these really core issues, like climate change and things that we just don't have a couple decades to slowly work toward a political realignment. In that sense, that I think many Americans just feel really uh, disillusioned, but also just scared. Like we're on the Titanic, we just have hit the iceberg, and yet everybody's still just kind of hanging out, hoping that it works itself out. That sense of urgency, it's manifesting itself in these protests, right? I mean, so it isn't like everybody's just sitting around. I mean, I think that there is this pressure cooker underneath the political system. Trump's election is I think in a weird way a manifestation of that, because and now after 4 years, we're seeing some of the scholarship on who voted for Trump. I mean, Hillary Clinton just dismissing Trump voters totally as a bunch of deplorables or whatever. That was just a huge mistake on her part to miss the real pain that much of America has been experiencing throughout this period that goes back to the 70s and in the 90s, when globalization was touted as this wonderful thing that was making everybody's lives better. And there were all of these Americans, and many of them white Americans, who saw their standard of living really decline. And those people, when they voted for Trump, they were voting for change, right? They were trying something new because the establishment had, in their view, failed them. I mean, you can say a lot of them voted for what they saw as tradition or continuity, right? So access to guns, or something based on tradition and faith. But I think the argument that Washington was fundamentally corrupt and inefficient, that it was working for a kind of globalization that wasn't beneficial to ordinary people. Many of those concerns have enough truth in them that we have to take them seriously. And I mean, Hillary Clinton was a terrible candidate in that regard, because she embodied the kind of globalization claims of the 90s that hadn't panned out for people. And I mean, you see this yearning for a different kind of America, and you can imagine harnessing that yearning in a way that if you can make a convincing if you can convince people that voting for universal health care is not moving down the road to socialism, but in fact just an expansion of their existing claims on the government. If you can convince people that these sorts of steps are beneficial in a form of redistributive capitalism, then I think that go ahead.
Do you think Biden indeed has his finger on that pulse? That is this, because I mean, I recognize that argument as being sort of in the background of the Democratic primaries. It was certainly there in the background of the Sanders. It was to the forefront of the Sanders campaign. Though I mean, I don't know to what extent you shared this, but when I was sort of listening and reading some of the speeches coming out of the Democratic convention, right, how Biden, Harris, and other prominent Democrats were making the case for themselves, that kind of argument, that the wider criticism of globalization that Trump and Sanders in their own way tapped into, was conspicuously absent. And really, you hear the argument being framed in terms of morality, right? Biden is simply a better, more responsible, more empathetic, person than Donald Trump. So do you think that is it? Is that do you see that as being there in the Democratic platform, in how the case for a Biden presidency is being made, or is this simply the realm of what could have been?
I think what Biden is, there was this moment during the lockdown where Biden wasn't really saying anything. He was just in his basement, and yet his polls were, he was consistently beating Trump in the polls. And everybody just kept saying, Biden, don't say anything. Just stay in your basement. And I remember thinking, this is kind of it, right? Like if Biden just keeps his mouth shut and kind of hunkers down and, keeps looking respectable and, like he's had a good record in the U.S. government, that he may win this thing. And I think in terms of the campaign, I mean, he's casting the net as wide as he can. He's trying to, hold on to the existing voters that, the Democratic base, and then win enough of these, I mean, who are these people who are still undecided, right? Like, I always wonder in a case like this, like, is anybody still kind of in the middle on this, But these swing states that Biden is trying to carry, I mean, his goal is to not come across as in any way attached to Bernie Sanders. Like, I wouldn't touch Bernie Sanders with a 10-foot pole, and because he knows that if it's if that's the if he has that reputation, then many of these Americans won't vote for him. And at the same time, I think he's, by bringing Kamala Harris on, he's showing recognition for the Black Lives Matter movement. He's showing that he's trying to kind of play to the left, but he knows in the end that the left will vote for him. And so, his main objective is winning, and then once he's in the White House, we'll just have to see how seriously he's going to pursue the kind of economic equality issues that. I'm back. Are you?
Yeah, we may have lost the last 5 seconds there. Sorry. Yeah, but the point came across, Mike.
Yeah, I'm really.
You can just edit out all the dumb things I say.
I mean, I'm not really 100% convinced that Biden, or if you want a ticket, Biden-Harris is the most suited one to appeal especially to the American left. If I go back watching at Kamala Harris voting record in the Senate just a few weeks ago, when Sanders proposed the adoption of a relief package for the families of those who have been affected by COVID-19, she voted against it. And she actually framed it as one of those measures that could have been perceived as socialist. So it is really hard to fight against that opposition against this idea that social democracy could work in the United States.
But think about if Biden goes to Kenosha, Wisconsin, and makes a speech, does he say the real issue here is longstanding race-based inequality that's connected to economic inequality, and what's going to solve this, including the rioting, is government programs aimed at creating jobs and better education opportunities. And no, I mean, he goes there to say, we understand that Black Lives Matter, but looting is wrong, right? And that's because if he feels that if he doesn't get ahead of Trump's law and order campaign, that ultimately Wisconsin could go to the Republicans. And,
yeah,
and
in fact,
the left
I
will always vote for Biden,
think
right?
that is the most viable strategy. That's okay. It was just trying to.
Well, it's sad because what it does is it takes the possibilities down to like you go from the campaign where everybody's attacking each other for not having the most expansive ideas about how to make America better, and you take that down to the bare minimum of how can we win over every possible voter, given Trump is taking this law and order approach. I mean, it's depressing, but at the same time, I think it is understandable, and it does make it really difficult to know what a Biden presidency will actually look like, because he's trying really hard to appeal to that sort of center and center right constituency. But once he's in the White House, if he wins, what will he actually pursue?
Okay. Do you think that Trump will be able to challenge him during a TV debate, for instance, on these issues, on the contents of his presidency, on the apparent inconsistency characterizing the Democratic Party, or will he go just personally?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Trump that's consistently sort of shocking is that how well he can say things that are not true and make them stick. Like the economy is doing great. There's never been a president who's worked harder on these kinds of economic issues, or never been a president who's been better for African Americans, or and the thing is that in the end, I mean, it doesn't matter to a lot of Americans whether it's true or false, right? It's like you end up believing in the person more than in the actual fact. It's you know what I mean? It's like this kind of there's this process of transmission where it doesn't really matter if it's true. What matters is that Trump is waging the good fight, and if we don't vote for Trump, then America goes down the tubes. And this is, I think, problematic for anybody who is living in reality, because you can only say so many times, hey, the economy's not doing well, or hey, what about the Voting Rights Act? Wasn't that better? I mean, it's like the sort of comparisons are just not working the way they should, and that I think is really problematic for American democracy as a whole, because if a sizable number of Americans just come to believe that the whole process will be fraudulent one way or another, that that Trump is the only one who can stave off these radicals who are trying to tear down what all the things that make America great, then it doesn't really matter what is said in the debate or what the tally of the ballots is. In the end, it's Trump or nothing. And what are those people going to do if Biden actually does win by 8 million votes? And I mean, what are they going to do when Trump says, hey, I think that there were millions of mail-in ballots that were fraudulent, or millions of people voted twice and they weren't even caught? It raises the stakes to such a degree that you wonder, and then of course it's almost conspiratorial. Like every time I read an article about gun sales, it's like another record has been broken. Like there's so many guns circulating around. Like what does it mean when you put all of this together? It just seems like a situation that is becoming so tense, and that I mean, that's getting back to our point earlier about why this election seems so unprecedented and filled with anxiety. In 2008, I didn't feel like if one side won or the other, that millions of people would just refuse the results and potentially go out into the street with guns. And now I kind of feel that way. Like, and you add in all the, Russia and China, and
this kind of attitude. Yeah, you're right. It's then the question may very well be you think that America's democratic antibodies are strong enough to either survive 4 more years of Trump or resist, the attempts to transform the system, in any way into a less democratic one, especially considering that the whole system of global governance that we try to establish, this liberal world order, is largely dependent on that democratic future.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting if you think about the enfranchisement of African Americans in the '60s, and the gains in terms of civil rights made by many groups in that period into the '70s. I mean, Native Americans, women, gay Americans. I mean, there's so many groups that and at the same time, the Watergate and the defeat in Vietnam, creating these movements to reform the government, to rein in the executive branch. I mean, there's such a threat to the status quo in that period from about '64 to 78 or so, and internationally too. You have this the non-aligned movement that is kind of turning into the new international economic order that is claiming, not just the right to exist, but the right to some form of economic justice, and saying that this world is fundamentally unequal, and we demand, not just, we want some foreign aid, we want justice, right? Which is the theme that sort of runs through all of this. And I think both domestically and internationally, the backlash is really intense. That the rise of the modern conservative movement that pulls in many of the former Democratic voters who then become these blue dog Democrats, they're able to reestablish in the United States a form of control that disenfranchises through mass incarceration and all of these other mechanisms, both in terms of economic inequality and these actual forms of punishment and that recreate in many ways the forms of inequality that had existed in previous decades. Internationally too, neoliberalism takes the demands for economic justice, and you jump from like 74 to 84, and Reagan is in Cancun saying, "Hey, it's going to be about liberalization, deregulation. I mean, we've got you now." And we're living in this moment where I think there is this rejection internationally of the kind of democracy that the U.S. is promoting, which is linked up to this kind of neoliberal capitalism and a very polyarchal form of electoral democracy, and domestically too. There's a backlash against a system that has really systematically pushed to the margins a big chunk of the population, and what's going to happen is I think in some way connected to this election.
Yeah. It's an argument, or at least it's an argument that I haven't heard put in quite that way for some time, and it's interesting the way you phrase that, the way that we can interpret the '80s, which is sometimes kind of portrayed purely as this age of liberalization, the shedding of government responsibility, the end of state control, as actually a reversal of control by certain groups within the American society. So is what we're witnessing the sort of overdue counter-revolution to Reagan?
I mean, Reagan takes office and he says government is not the solution, right? Government is a problem. And Trump takes office and he says, in as many words, I'm here to drain the swamp and return power to the states. But I think that the problem is that, Trump, Reagan was a former governor of California. I mean, he was much smarter than many of his critics gave him credit for then or now, right? And he was part of a rising movement that had a lot of energy behind it and new ideas. And Trump is he's on the tail end of the Reagan era,
Mm-hmm.
and he doesn't really bring any big new ideas. He just brings his own. I don't even think he thought he was going to win. I think he thought this is going to be great for Trump hotels, right? And so his kind of transactional approach is limited in what it can in terms of a policy framework. I don't think that there's very much to go on, except that he tends toward these kind of crony capitalist and authoritarian leaders, maybe just because by his own personality, that's what seems to make the most sense.
I mean, he still strikes us as a creature of that historical era, right, of the 1980s, of that kind of the Manhattan real estate boom, to the extent that, I mean, even Trump's personality has shoulder pads, right? This is a guy who's mentally still occupies that era. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's interesting because Mike was, I think, kind of interpreting Trump more as a symptom of a chronic disease affecting U.S. democracy than a disease in itself. And the symptom can be cured. And in this case, I mean, all it takes is reform, genuine reform.
But I think it is interesting when you look at what's happening in the U.S. and then you look at these other places that democracy experts talk about backsliding, right? So a place like Turkey, and there is this sense of the liberal order is as a whole backsliding, and the question then becomes, is what's happening in the U.S. particular to the U.S. Legacy of race-based discrimination, or is there something bigger that we can't quite put our finger on why this is happening all at once? I mean, I think that one part of it is that around the globe there are millions of people who just feel like they've been left behind by globalization, right? They feel like that they're the losers, and maybe they are, maybe they're not. I mean, so you look at the standard of living in the U.S., even for lower middle class Americans, it's hard to say that they're the true losers of globalization. But you can certainly see how people like that look at their parents' generation and their grandparents' generation and say, we were supposed to have a better life than our parents, and we don't, right? We're struggling to pay off our master's degree, and we barely have enough money to buy the kids Christmas presents, and this kind of thing, I think, is a sign that there are both unique problems to the U.S. that are fueling things like Black Lives Matter, and there are these broader trends that go back to the onset of modern globalization, but especially that period after the Cold War, when alternatives were really just dismissed, right? And that there weren't a lot of sort of lessons learned, and the whole peace dividend idea didn't really go anywhere, and I think that those concerns are really legitimate, and it's just a shame that the Republican Party doesn't put forth a candidate who can actually speak to working class Americans in a way that's not just total lies. I mean, the Trump, what's hard to watch is that Trump is appealing to these voters, and that you look at his accomplishments on on issues that they're most interested in, and I mean, you can say, well, his appointments, his federal court appointments, on issues like abortion, they're getting their money's worth, but on these other issues like the taxes and stimulating the economy, and it's really quite tragic, right? It's tragic to imagine the kids of these lower middle class families looking at a future that's even grimmer than their parents.
Yeah.
I like your long-term approach, Mike, even though a common friend of ours say that we are still living in the long shadow of 2008. and that all of this is just the repercussion of that crisis, so that the feeling of dispossession, of resentment also is related to that. I tend to agree instead that it has like deeper roots than just that crisis that have to be traced back to the distortions of globalization. To what extent the new president will be able to address these issues, I still don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm teaching this Politics North America course, and as we get closer to the election, I just, feel more and more nervous trying to, just sort of identify the key issues, because everything seems to be just on a razor's edge, and I think that one way or another, it's going to be memorable. Let's just put it that way.
Okay, you just gave us the title for this chat.
It's going to be memorable.
Did your students ask you for any prediction, Mike?
Well, this semester we're all online, so I post the lectures, and I haven't had a chance yet to do the Q&A in person with them, or at least live on screen. And so when we do that, hopefully they'll have all kinds of good questions. We better cut it short. I hear my neighbors outside. And, so.
Okay. Well, this has been great. It's been really a great pleasure to have you with us, Mike. Thanks a lot for your comments and enlightening views. Let me thank you on behalf of the whole NASA and RIAS. Good luck with your teaching, with your family, both here in the Netherlands and in the United States, and hopefully see you soon live.
Great. Well, thank you guys, and take care. Hope to see you soon.
Thanks very much, Mike, and goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.